This video contains graphic descriptions of violence and disturbing content related to real-life events, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
All right, let's dive into the chilling case of Dennis Nilsen.
A name that still haunts Britain, yeah.
We're going deeper than the headlines this time.
Oh, much deeper.
Using excerpts from a book about him and a collection of images.
Some pretty disturbing stuff.
So buckle up for this one. Ready to unpack the story of Nilsen, understand his crimes, and explore what made him, well, him.
It's a dark journey, but a fascinating one.
Absolutely. Now, the sources paint this kind of bleak picture of his early life, right?
Yeah, a lot of isolation, especially around Christmas 75. It seems like a real turning point.
Right, like it's highlighted as this pivotal moment.
It's fascinating, really, how this lack of genuine connection early on, seems to have manifested in his crimes later.
So he wasn't just lonely. This loneliness warped into something much darker.
Exactly. It's like he was trying to create his own twisted version of connection, of control.
And that takes us to his first victim, right? New Year's Eve, 1978. He meets this young Irish guy at a pub and invites him back to his flat.
Yeah, and that encounter sets off this terrifying pattern. Nilsen strangles and drowns the young man. Then he bathes and dresses the body, even places it in an armchair.
God, it's like he's trying to deny the reality of death to maintain this bizarre connection even after the victim's gone.
That's a key insight. It wasn't just about killing, for Nilsen. It was about possessing these young men, trying to freeze them in time.
And this horrific ritual just repeats itself over and over. He keeps luring these young men, a lot of them homeless or struggling, from pubs back to his place.
His modus operandi is chillingly predictable. He preyed on the vulnerable, those who might not be missed right away.
The sources talk about rent boys, specifically. What does that actually mean?
Rent boys was the term back then for young men who engaged in sex work, often because of really difficult circumstances. Many of Nilsen's victims fit this description, really highlights the societal issues, that contribute to their vulnerability.
It's just awful. This reminder of how predators like Nilsen exploit those on the fringes of society.
It is. And the fact that he could operate for so long, preying on these young men who slip through the cracks, it raises serious questions, about the systems that were supposed to protect them.
Now, there's this young man in the sources. They call him Bleep. He almost became a victim, but managed to escape.
Bleep's story is like this chilling glimpse, right, into what Nilsen was doing behind closed doors. He was found tied up in Nilsen's flat, but alive, thank God.
It's incredible he escaped, but terrifying, because it means Nilsen just kept going until the drain blockage, right?
Exactly. That blockage at 23 Cranley Gardens, Nilsen's flat, it's what finally exposed everything.
So imagine, you're Mike Catron, you're a plumber, called to fix a drain. Routine, right? And then you find human remains.
Awful. The article, it describes pieces of flesh and bone clogging the drain. It's thanks to Catron, he alerts the authorities. That's what leads to Nilsen's arrest.
And when the police arrive, Nilsen, he just calmly confesses to killing 15 or 16 people. It's chilling. So detached from what he'd done.
Yeah, that confession and all the evidence in his flat painted a truly horrifying picture.
Speaking of his flat, we have these images of 23 Cranley Gardens. It's hard to look at them. This ordinary-looking place, the site of such horrific acts.
They offer a window into Nilsen's world, don't they? That cramped attic room where so many were killed, bags of limbs, internal organs just scattered around. It really underscores the scale, the depravity.
Hard to fathom the darkness that happened within those walls.
Absolutely. The images, they bring it home, the stark reality of 23 Cranley Gardens.
Now, the sources talk about these pubs Nilsen frequented, the Salisbury, the Cricklewood Arms, his hunting grounds.
He seemed to target pubs in North London, places where he'd find vulnerable young men, often homeless, struggling with other issues,
So he had a type and knew where to find them. It's chilling. Even in a bustling city, predators can blend in, just waiting to exploit the most vulnerable.
It makes you think about the social context. This wasn't just random violence. He targeted those overlooked, marginalized.
It's tragic, isn't it? Even in a city like London, darkness can lurk in the shadows, preying on those most at risk.
Makes you think about how we as a society can better protect them.
Okay, so we've covered his early life, how he operated, the drain blockage, that horrific flat. But what about the man himself? His psychology, what made him tick?
Well, one of the most striking things is just the lack of remorse. It's like he observed his crimes from a distance, detached from the emotional weight.
So instead of just saying evil, which is too easy, maybe we should be asking, What created this disconnect? A defense mechanism? Something deeper?
That's a good question. It's not about excusing him, but trying to understand what led to this horrific outcome.
And that brings us to the next part, right?
Yeah.
The trial and all those conflicting psychological assessments.
Right. The trial becomes this exploration of the human mind, the complexity of criminal responsibility.
So this trial, it becomes a battleground of psychology. What were some of the key viewpoints?
Well, some experts, they thought Nilsen might have had a severe personality disorder, even psychopathy. That could explain the lack of empathy, the remorse.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't like psychology experts, break that down. What's a personality disorder and how does it relate to Nilsen?
Sure. Basically, a personality disorder, it's a mental health condition. You have these rigid, unhealthy patterns of thinking, behaving, functioning, affects your relationships, work, your whole well-being. Some experts argued that Nilsen's actions, the methodical way he chose victims, the lack of remorse, the need for control, it all pointed to a personality disorder, one that made it difficult to form healthy attachments and to understand the impact of his actions.
So not just evil, but a condition that skewed his perception of the world and how he related to others.
Exactly. And it's complex. A diagnosis, it doesn't excuse his crimes, but it can help us understand the potential underlying factors.
Now, were there any other perspectives on Nilsen's mental state? I mean, I imagine not everyone bought into the personality disorder idea.
You're right. Other experts, they thought, yeah, his actions were horrific, but maybe they stemmed from this profound loneliness, this desperate need for control, rather than a complete lack of empathy. And they pointed to his childhood, the isolation, as potential factors.
So almost like a nature versus nurture debate, right? Playing out in court. Did the jury have to decide which psychological interpretation was more accurate?
In a way, yeah. They had to weigh the horror of the crimes against the complexities of his mental state, determine if he was fully responsible.
And what was the verdict?
Guilty. On 6 counts of murder, 2 of attempted murder. Despite his defense arguing for diminished responsibility, life imprisonment.
Must have been a tough decision for that jury.
Absolutely. This case, it brings up all these questions about mental health, criminal behavior, even the definition of justice.
As we're going through this, it's hard not to think about the bigger picture, the societal context. We talked about rent boys earlier. Could you elaborate on that subculture in London back then? How it might have made these young men more vulnerable?
Sure. These rent boys, as they were called, they were often young guys, homeless, struggling with poverty, other tough situations. They were driven to sex work. Many were estranged from their families, lacked any support.
So they were already invisible to most of society, on the margins, easier targets for someone like Nilsen.
Exactly. And it really highlights the systemic issues, right? The things that contribute to these tragedies. Nilsen's crimes, they weren't isolated. They were intertwined with poverty, homelessness, the exploitation of these vulnerable individuals.
It's a reminder that these issues, they're still with us. We need to work towards a society where everyone has support, protection.
Absolutely. We need to be mindful of those most at risk, create a safety net that prevents this kind of exploitation.
Now, we talked about Nilsen's lack of remorse, but let's dig deeper into his psyche. There's this quote, "I have tears for the situation they were in for my action." What do you make of that?
That's a powerful quote. It shows the twisted logic he used to justify himself, like he believed he was somehow relieving their suffering.
It's like he saw himself as some sort of, twisted savior.
Yeah, like he was bringing mercy, and that delusion, that warped reality, that's maybe the most disturbing part of it all, the depths of depravity the human mind can reach.
Chilling reminder that the line between good and evil, sanity and madness, it can be so thin.
It shows how important it is to understand human behavior, the light and the dark in us all.
You've hit on something there, that need to acknowledge the darkness within. Maybe, just maybe, by understanding what drives someone like Nilsen, we can prevent these horrors from happening again.
I agree. Understanding that potential for darkness, that's the first step to creating a world where these tragedies are less likely.
Okay, let's shift gears to the final part of this deep dive. Let's focus on the lasting impact of Nilsen's crimes.
Important to consider. The impact of these acts, they go way beyond the immediate victims.
We've talked about Nilsen, but what about his victims, their families? What happened to them?
A lot of them, they were never identified. Sad, really. Nilsen, he couldn't even remember all their names. Made it impossible for the police to piece it all together, to notify families.
Can you imagine that? Not knowing what happened to your loved one? Just limbo, wondering, hoping, grieving. No closure.
Devastating. Robbed not only of their loved ones, but the chance to mourn, to say goodbye.
It shows you the ripple effect, right? This pain that goes way beyond the victims themselves. Shatters families, communities, leaves scars that last for generations.
It's true. Violence, it has consequences, impacts so many lives in ways we can't even comprehend.
You mentioned some powerful images earlier. Any that really stand out?
There's this map of London. It's got Nilsen's flat, 23 Cranley Gardens marked at the center, and then all these other locations dotted around it. The pubs he went to, the places where victims were last seen.
God, this chilling. Like a visual representation of his hunting grounds.
Exactly. It shows you these weren't random acts. This was a pattern, this methodical approach, finding and exploiting these young men.
It's scary how calculated it was. Predators, they choose their victims. They target those who won't be missed, those who won't raise any alarms.
And that's why we need to be aware. The tactics they use, educate ourselves and others about the signs of grooming, of exploitation, protect those who are vulnerable.
So we're wrapping up our deep dive into Dennis Nilsen. I'm left with this mix of horror, fascination, and just deep sadness for the victims, for their families.
It stays with you, this case. Makes you confront that dark side of human nature. Challenges what you think about evil, sanity, how fragile life is.
But it teaches us something too, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. It reminds us to be vigilant, to recognize the signs, the abuse, the exploitation, and to speak up, right? When something feels wrong, it shows us we need a strong safety net to protect those who are vulnerable.
Maybe, just maybe, by digging into this darkness, by understanding what can drive someone to do this, we can prevent it from happening again.
That's what we hope for. Shine a light on these dark corners and maybe find a way to make things better for everyone.
Well said. To everyone listening, we'll leave you with this. In a world where darkness can feel so strong, how can you be a force for good? How can you help build a society that values compassion, empathy, and protects those most at risk?
A good question to think about. A call to action. We hope it stays with you.